You think you know ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and Western civilization. Plato pondering in his academy, Socrates teaching wisdom in the agora, Aristotle tutoring Alexander the Great. These men were geniuses who shaped human thought for millennia. Except there's something your history textbook conveniently left out. Behind every celebrated philosopher stood dozens of young boys whose lives were systematically destroyed in ways that make medieval torture look merciful. Meet the Erastes Eromenos system. That's the Greek term for what they called pedagogical love. Sounds noble, right? Here's what it actually meant. Wealthy philosophers would acquire boys, typically between 12 and 15 years old, as special students. These weren't regular students who showed up for lessons and went home. These were boys who lived in the philosopher's household, served his every need, and received a very particular kind of education that had nothing to do with logic or ethics. The system worked like this. Poor families across Greece would receive offers from philosophical schools. Your son could study under the greatest minds of the age, live in comfort, and gain connections that would secure his future. For families struggling to feed their children, this seemed like divine intervention. What they didn't know was that they were essentially selling their sons into a form of slavery so normalized that Greek society had built an entire philosophical framework to justify it. Take the Academy of Plato, founded around 387 BC. At any given time, Plato's household included between 15 and 30 young male servants. Official records called them students or attendants, but everyone knew what they really were. These boys would be selected not for their intellectual promise, but for their physical appearance. Philosophers would attend slave markets and auctions specifically to acquire the most attractive young males available. The prettier the boy, the higher the price, the greater the prestige for the philosopher who owned him. The selection process was grotesque. Boys would be made to strip naked while philosophers examined their bodies like livestock. They checked teeth for straightness, muscles for tone, skin for smoothness. Genitals were inspected for size and development. Boys who showed signs of early puberty were considered less desirable because the Greeks prized prepubescent features. Some families would actually delay their son's puberty through diet manipulation and herbal treatments to make them more marketable to philosophical households. Once selected, the boy would be taken from his family with great ceremony. The philosopher would present gifts to the parents, usually a modest sum of money and promises of future benefits. The family would celebrate, believing their son was entering an apprenticeship that would elevate the entire household's status. Village priests would bless the arrangement. The community would congratulate the lucky family whose son had been chosen by such an esteemed teacher. The first night in the philosopher's house shattered every illusion. While official documents described elaborate welcoming ceremonies focused on intellectual initiation, the reality was far darker. New arrivals would be introduced to the symposium, the nightly drinking parties that were central to Greek philosophical culture. But these weren't just intellectual discussions over wine. These were events where young servants were displayed, half naked or completely nude, forced to pour drinks, serve food, and provide entertainment to drunk philosophers and their guests. The symposium followed a pattern that would repeat every night for years. It began innocently enough with food and conversation. As wine flowed, the tone shifted. Philosophers would begin praising the beauty of their young servants, composing poems about their physical features, debating which boy possessed the most perfect form. The servants were expected to stand still while being discussed like objects, their bodies evaluated and compared in explicit detail. Here's what really makes your stomach turn. These same men who spent their days teaching about virtue, justice, and the nature of the soul spent their nights treating children like sexual commodities. Plato wrote extensively about the higher love between teacher and student, calling it a pathway to understanding divine beauty. What he meant in practice was that he believed his attraction to teenage boys was spiritually superior to normal relationships. The philosophy wasn't describing love. It was providing intellectual cover for systematic abuse. The servants quickly learned the unspoken rules. Resist or show disgust, and you'd be beaten by older servants who had learned to survive by enforcing the system on newcomers. Complain or try to contact your family, and you'd be sold to a worse situation, maybe to the mines where life expectancy was measured in months. The only path to survival was complete submission and hoping you'd eventually age out of desirability. But here's the thing that would haunt these boys forever. Greek society didn't just tolerate this system, they celebrated it. Pottery from the period depicts these relationships as beautiful and noble. Poetry praised the love between philosophers and their young favorites. Parents who managed to get their sons into prestigious households bragged about the connection. The entire civilization had convinced itself that destroying children's innocence was actually a form of education. The psychological manipulation was masterful. Philosophers would frame every abuse as a lesson. They called it mentorship when they isolated boys from their families. They called it character building when they broke down their resistance. They called it philosophical instruction when they violated them. The boys were taught that submitting to their master's desires was necessary for spiritual growth, that their suffering had meaning, that they were privileged to receive such attention from great minds. Some boys tried to adapt by becoming model servants, hoping perfect obedience would earn them protection or eventual freedom. Others retreated into themselves, developing the blank stares and mechanical movements of the deeply traumatized. A few attempted rebellion, which always ended badly. But all of them, every single one, carried the knowledge that Greek law offered them no protection. Their families wouldn't believe them, and society viewed them as fortunate rather than victimized. The philosophers kept detailed records of their favorites. Letters between intellectuals would casually mention trading servants or recommending particularly beautiful boys to colleagues. These weren't secret transactions. They were normal business conducted openly because Greek culture saw nothing wrong with it. Socrates, the man famous for questioning everything, never questioned this. Aristotle, who categorized all of nature, categorized young male bodies by their appeal. The greatest minds of the ancient world built their legacy on the broken spirits of children. But wait, it gets worse. Because the philosophy lessons, the symposium humiliations, the nightly violations, those were just the beginning. What happened behind closed doors, in the private chambers of these celebrated thinkers, was so disturbing that even ancient Greeks who accepted so much occasionally whispered about it in horror. The acquisition of young servants wasn't random. Philosophers approached it with the same systematic thinking they applied to everything else. They developed criteria, established networks, and created a sophisticated market where boys were commodities evaluated on precise specifications. This wasn't impulse buying, this was calculated hunting. Plato's academy had agents who traveled throughout Greece and beyond, visiting poor villages and identifying families with attractive sons. These scouts would observe boys at public gatherings, at gymnasia where young males exercised naked as was customary, at religious festivals. They took notes on physical characteristics, family backgrounds, and temperament. A shy, compliant boy was worth more than an outspoken one. Beauty combined with passivity commanded premium prices. The actual purchase involved elaborate contracts that parents couldn't fully understand. Written in technical legal language, these documents gave the philosopher complete authority over the boy's life. The term used was pedagogical guardianship, which sounded respectable. What it meant in practice was that the philosopher owned the boy more completely than if he'd purchased him as a regular slave. Regular slaves had some legal protections. These students had none because they weren't classified as slaves. They were classified as willing participants in an educational relationship. Here's where the system revealed its true genius of cruelty. Because the arrangement was framed as educational rather than slavery, the boys had no recourse under Greek law. A slave who was abused beyond accepted norms could theoretically appeal to authorities or be protected by laws governing property damage. These philosophical servants couldn't. Any complaint would be dismissed as a student being ungrateful to his generous teacher. The legal framework specifically protected the philosophers while rendering their victims invisible. The contracts typically lasted until the boy reached 18 or 20. though philosophers could extend them indefinitely by claiming the education wasn't complete. Some boys remained in philosophical households well into their 20s, long past the age when they'd lost the physical characteristics that had made them desirable in the first place. By then, they'd been so thoroughly broken that they had nowhere else to go. Let's talk about what access meant in these contracts. The documents specified that the philosopher had rights to the boy's labor, his time, his presence at all hours. But everyone understood the unwritten clause. The philosopher had rights to the boy's body whenever he wanted, however he wanted, with whoever he wanted. These children could be used by the master, loaned to colleagues, or offered to important guests as entertainment. Their consent was never considered because the contract had already granted perpetual consent on their behalf. The day-to-day reality was a nightmare of constant availability. Boys slept near their master's chamber, sometimes in the same room, always within calling distance. They were awakened at any hour for any purpose. During the day, they attended to regular servant duties like cooking, cleaning, and running errands. During evening symposia, they served drinks and food while being groped by drunk philosophers and their guests. Late at night came the private lessons that left them unable to sleep. Some philosophical households developed hierarchies among the servants. New arrivals were assigned to older boys who taught them how to survive. This sounds protective until you understand what it really meant. The older servants had been so damaged by years of abuse that they'd adopted their tormentors' values. They would rape the newer, younger boys as a way of asserting what little power they had. The philosophers encouraged this because it meant less work for them and created a system where the victims policed each other. The case of Phaedo illustrates how thoroughly this broke human beings. Phaedo was purchased by a philosopher in Athens when he was about 13. Initially resistant, he was broken down by older servants who told him resistance only made things worse. Within a year, Phaedo had become one of the compliant ones, performing his duties mechanically, showing no emotion. When Socrates supposedly freed him and made him a philosopher in his own right, Phaedo never spoke about what had happened during those years. His later philosophical writings include passionate defenses of the Erastes-Eromenos system. His abusers had so completely destroyed his sense of self that he spent his adult life justifying what had been done to him. But Phaedo was one of the lucky ones because he survived and achieved some status. Most servants never made that transition. They existed in a perpetual present of violation and humiliation, with no hope of escape. Their families, if they maintained contact at all, believed the lies in the occasional letters the philosophers forced the boys to write. Everything is wonderful. I'm learning so much. I'm grateful for this opportunity. These letters were written under supervision, and any deviation would result in punishment. The punishment methods reveal just how calculated this cruelty was. Physical beating was common but not preferred because visible injuries raised questions. Instead, philosophers developed psychological torture techniques. Boys would be isolated in darkness for days. They'd be forced to watch other servants being punished, knowing their turn was coming. They'd be deprived of food until they performed degrading acts to earn meals. They'd be given impossible tasks and punished for inevitable failure. One particularly vicious technique involved fake freedom offers. A philosopher would tell a boy he'd earned his release and could return home. The boy would be given travel supplies and sent away. But the household would have already sent messages ahead to ensure he'd be returned, usually beaten by strangers who thought they were helping recover a runaway slave. When the boy was dragged back, the philosopher would deliver a speech about how freedom was meaningless without wisdom, how the boy had proven himself unworthy. It was designed to crush hope permanently. The sexual exploitation followed patterns too. Philosophers would start slowly with new arrivals, gradually escalating the abuse to overwhelm resistance through incremental boundary violations. What seemed merely inappropriate the first week would seem minor compared to what happened the second week, which would seem minor compared to the third. By the time the worst occurred, the boys were so psychologically damaged that they couldn't even identify what was happening to them as wrong anymore. Greek society provided philosophical justification for every aspect of this horror. They called it mentorship when philosophers isolated boys from their support systems. They called it education when they stripped boys of autonomy. They called it love when they violated them repeatedly. The entire intellectual edifice of classical Greek philosophy included elaborate arguments for why this was not only acceptable, but spiritually beneficial for the boys. Plato's Symposium, studied in universities today as a profound meditation on love, is actually a detailed description of one of these drinking parties where young servants were displayed and discussed as sexual objects. Modern scholars teach it as metaphorical or theoretical. It wasn't. It was Plato documenting his regular evening entertainment, writing down the actual conversations he and his colleagues had while using children. Aristotle wrote that some people were natural slaves, meant to serve their betters. He wasn't just talking about regular slavery. He was specifically justifying the philosophical household system, arguing that these boys needed to be controlled by superior minds because they lacked the capacity for full rational development. He wrote this while keeping several young male servants in his household, servants whose capacity for rational development was never given a chance because they were too busy servicing his needs. The worst part about the contracts was the payment structure. Families received a small initial payment, then nothing else unless the boy died, in which case they might receive a token compensation for their loss. But they'd also signed away all future claims. If a boy was injured, disabled, or driven insane by his treatment, the family had no right to recover him or demand additional payment. They'd sold their son completely, and the law sided entirely with the purchaser. Some families never saw their sons again after the initial handover. The philosophers would claim the boy was progressing well and needed to focus on his studies without the distraction of family visits. Years would pass. Parents would die, never knowing what had happened to their children. Some boys forgot their own family names after years of being called only by pet names or numbers within the household. And Greek law had a special provision that made escape nearly impossible. If a servant fled from a philosophical household, he could be captured and returned by any citizen. The punishment for attempted escape wasn't just beating. It was public humiliation designed to deter others from trying. The runaway would be displayed in the agora, the city center, with signs describing his ingratitude and lack of character. He'd be whipped publicly, while a herald explained how generous his master had been, how this boy had betrayed not just his teacher, but the entire philosophical tradition of Greece. But wait, it gets worse. Because even if a boy somehow survived years of this treatment, even if he aged out of desirability and was released, Greek society had one more cruelty waiting. The stigma of having been a philosophical servant marked them for life in ways that made normal existence impossible. The philosophers didn't just abuse these boys. They wrote about it. They theorized about it. They created entire philosophical frameworks to justify and celebrate what they were doing. This wasn't hidden perversion. This was documented ideology, preserved in texts that scholars still study today without fully acknowledging what they're reading. Plato's Phaedrus is taught as a dialogue about the nature of love and the soul. Read it carefully, and you'll see it's actually a detailed defense of why older men should pursue sexual relationships with adolescent boys. Plato argues that physical desire for young males is the beginning of philosophical enlightenment, that attraction to boyish beauty leads the soul upward toward understanding eternal forms. He's not speaking metaphorically. He's literally arguing that his sexual desire for teenage servants is spiritually superior to normal adult relationships. The Symposium takes this further. Each speaker at Plato's drinking party delivers a speech praising different aspects of love, but they're all specifically discussing relationships between adult men and adolescent boys. Pausanias, one of the speakers, explicitly distinguishes between common love, which he dismisses, and heavenly love, which he defines as the attraction of an older man to a boy between 12 and 18. He argues this type of love is nobler because it focuses on the boy's developing mind rather than just his body. What he's actually describing is grooming techniques wrapped in philosophical language. Here's what makes this so insidious. These texts became the foundation of Western philosophy. For over 2,000 years, scholars have studied these works, praising their insights into human nature and love. but they were reading sanitized translations and interpretations that obscured what was actually being discussed. When Plato writes about the lover and the beloved, he's not talking about equals. He's talking about the philosopher and his teenage servant. When he describes the beloved's initial resistance giving way to acceptance, he's describing the breaking down of a child's boundaries. Aristotle contributed his own justifications. In his Politics, he argues that some humans are naturally suited to be ruled by others, that they lack the rational capacity for self-governance. While this applied to his views on slavery generally, he specifically used it to justify the philosophical household system. Young males, he wrote, possessed incomplete rationality that required guidance and control by mature philosophical minds. What he meant was that teenage boys needed to submit completely to their masters because they weren't capable of understanding what was best for them. The philosophical method itself became a tool of abuse. Socrates was famous for his questioning technique, using dialogue to expose contradictions in people's thinking. But apply that method to a teenage servant who's trying to resist sexual advances, and it becomes something much darker. The philosopher would use logic to dismantle every argument the boy made for why this was wrong. Through careful questioning, he'd force the boy to either admit logical inconsistencies or accept that submission was rational. It was intellectual coercion that left victims feeling like they'd consented through their own reasoning. Some philosophers developed elaborate rituals around their abuse. They'd frame violations as initiations into philosophical mysteries. A boy's first sexual experience with his master would be presented as a sacred rite, a necessary step in his intellectual development. The philosopher would deliver speeches about how this act connected them to ancient traditions, how it opened the boy's mind to higher truths. It was all calculated to make the victim feel like resistance would be not just disobedience, but intellectual failure. The sharing economy among philosophers was particularly grotesque. Letters between intellectuals casually mentioned lending servants to colleagues for visits. When a philosopher traveled, he might bring one of his favorites as a gift for his host. These transactions were documented in correspondence that still exists, written in the same tone someone might use to discuss lending a book or sharing a recipe. The complete dehumanization is chilling. Plato's Academy formalized this through institutional practices. New members were expected to acquire at least one young servant as proof of their philosophical commitment. The Academy had specific chambers designated for private instruction, small rooms with lockable doors where philosophers could take their students for extended lessons. Everyone knew what happened in those rooms. The sounds that came from them were audible throughout the complex. But it was never discussed openly because doing so would be philosophically gauche. The concept of philosophical friendship was corrupted beyond recognition. When these thinkers wrote about philia, the deep bond between teacher and student, they were describing relationships built on coercion and power imbalance. The student's love for his teacher wasn't affection. It was survival strategy, trauma bonding, and Stockholm Syndrome wrapped in philosophical terminology. Some servants tried to use philosophy itself as resistance. They'd engage their masters in genuine intellectual debate, hoping to prove themselves as thinking beings deserving of respect. This usually backfired catastrophically. Philosophers would become enraged at servants who questioned too effectively, viewing it as dangerous uppityness. These boys would be punished more severely than those who never tried to engage intellectually. The lesson was clear. You're here for your body, not your mind. The age progression was calculated. Philosophers preferred boys who had just entered puberty because they represented a specific aesthetic ideal to Greek sensibilities. But they also wanted boys young enough to be shaped completely, without prior relationships or fully formed identities. The sweet spot was 12 to 15 years old, young enough to be malleable but developed enough to be sexualized. Boys outside this range were considered less desirable, though they'd still be used until they aged out completely. Here's something that reveals the systematic nature of this abuse. The philosophical schools developed training programs for new acquisitions. Older servants would teach younger ones proper behavior, how to move, how to speak, how to respond to advances. This wasn't kindness. It was the institutionalization of grooming, turning the victims into tools for breaking in new victims. The system was self-perpetuating, with each generation of damaged boys helping to damage the next. The festivals honoring Eros, the god of love, became showcases for these relationships. Philosophers would attend with their young favorites, displaying them publicly as proof of their refined taste. There were actual competitions where philosophers presented their servants and judges, evaluated which pairing best embodied the ideal of philosophical love. The boys were rated like livestock while their masters received laurel wreaths for having the best specimen. Medical texts from the period reveal even darker dimensions. Greek physicians wrote treatises on maintaining young male beauty, including dietary restrictions, exercise regimens, and even surgical interventions to delay puberty. Some philosophers would have their servants undergo procedures to remove body hair, alter their voices, or preserve juvenile features. These weren't isolated practices. They were recommended techniques discussed in medical literature. The psychological damage was so severe that some boys developed complete dissociation. Ancient texts mention servants who would stare blankly during abuse, seeming to be mentally absent. This wasn't acceptance. It was the mind's desperate attempt to escape what the body couldn't. Philosophers would sometimes prefer these dissociated boys because they were easier to manage, requiring less coercion. The complete psychological destruction of a human being was seen as convenient. But the philosophy wasn't just justification, it was instruction manual. When Plato described the proper way to pursue a beloved, he was teaching techniques. When Aristotle categorized different types of friendships, he was creating frameworks for managing servants. These texts that universities teach as abstract ethics were actually practical guides for exploitation, written by men who were actively exploiting children while writing them. And here's what keeps you awake once you understand it. These same texts shaped Western civilization. Our concepts of love, education, and mentorship are built on foundations laid by men who were literally abusing children while writing about virtue. Every time someone quotes Socrates about examining your life, they're quoting a man who owned teenage boys. Every time Plato's cave allegory is taught as profound wisdom, students are learning from someone who kept a household of young male servants for his personal use. But wait, it gets worse. Because the philosophical justifications weren't just for Greek consumption. These texts were preserved, translated, and studied for centuries. During the Renaissance, European scholars revived these ideas, and with them, the practices. The philosophical defense of pederasty influenced educational institutions across Europe for hundreds of years. You might be wondering why there aren't more records of servants fighting back, escaping, or exposing their masters. The answer is that they tried. They tried constantly. And what happened to them was so horrific that it functioned as deterrent for everyone else watching. The case of Lysis is documented in multiple sources, though modern scholars tend to gloss over the details. Lysis was a servant in the household of a prominent Athenian philosopher around 420 BC. According to surviving accounts, he was considered exceptionally intelligent and beautiful, making him a prized possession. When he was about 16, Lysis attempted to expose his master's abuses to authorities. He went to the Areopagus, the court that handled serious crimes. He testified before the judges, describing in explicit detail what had been done to him and other boys in the household. He presented evidence, including letters and testimony from other servants. He expected justice. What he got was a nightmare that became legend. The judges dismissed his case immediately, not because they didn't believe him, but because what he described wasn't illegal. The philosopher had purchased legal guardianship. He had the right to discipline and educate his servant as he saw fit. Lysis's testimony, instead of condemning his master, condemned himself. He'd violated the fundamental social compact by publicly shaming his benefactor. The punishment was public castration, not surgical castration performed by a physician. Street castration, performed in the agora by whoever wanted to participate. Lysis was stripped naked, tied to a post, and mutilated by a mob while city officials watched approvingly. The procedure took over an hour. He bled out slowly while people jeered. His body was left displayed for 3 days as a warning to other servants who might consider similar betrayal. But here's the detail that makes this even more horrifying. His master attended the execution. The philosopher stood in the crowd and delivered an impromptu speech about how Lysis's ingratitude proved that some people were incapable of appreciating philosophical education. He used his servant's public torture as a teaching moment about the nature of justice, and people applauded. After Lysis, very few servants ever tried official channels again, but rebellion took other forms, usually subtle and ultimately futile. Some boys would try self-mutilation, damaging their own faces or bodies to make themselves less attractive. This rarely worked. Scarred boys could still be used, and now they were damaged property that inspired even less sympathy. Some philosophers would force these boys into even more degrading roles as punishment for destroying their own beauty. Escape attempts were common but almost never successful. Greece was a collection of city-states with strong communication networks. Philosophers had connections everywhere. A runaway servant would be recognized and returned within days. The punishment for running away was creative. The philosopher Protagoras was famous for his treatment of runaways. He'd have them publicly flogged, then force them to perform degrading acts in the agora while explaining to the crowd why they'd been ungrateful. Then he'd lock them in small wooden boxes barely large enough to crouch in, keeping them there for weeks. When they emerged, they were psychologically broken, their spirits completely crushed. Some boys tried to kill themselves. Greek records mention servants drowning themselves, jumping from cliffs, or taking poison. But even death wasn't always an escape. If a servant died by suicide, his family could be held financially responsible for the loss of property. The philosopher could sue the dead boy's parents for the full purchase price plus lost value. Some families were bankrupted by their sons' suicides, which served as another layer of deterrent. A few servants tried to kill their masters instead. These cases were treated as the gravest possible crimes. One documented case involved a 15-year-old named Cleomenes, who stabbed his master during an assault. He didn't kill the philosopher, just wounded him. The punishment was systematic torture designed to last as long as possible. Cleomenes was handed over to other servants in the household, who were told they'd all be punished if he died too quickly. They kept him alive and suffering for 17 days before he finally expired. What's striking about these rebellion attempts is how isolated they were. The system was designed to prevent solidarity among servants. Different philosophical households competed with each other, creating rivalries that extended to their servants. Boys were taught to view servants from other households as inferior. This prevented any collective resistance from forming. Each boy fought alone, which meant each boy failed alone. The few times servants did try to organize collective action, the response was overwhelming. Around 380 BC, a group of servants from several philosophical households allegedly planned a mass escape. Someone informed, probably an older servant hoping for favor. The philosophers coordinated a response that became an example for generations. Every servant involved was tracked down. Some were killed outright. Others were mutilated publicly as warnings. The ringleaders were subjected to something worse. They were handed over to their fellow servants to be punished. The philosophers told the remaining boys that they'd all be held responsible if the ringleaders weren't properly disciplined. What followed was a nightmare of victims destroying victims. Boys who'd planned to escape together were forced to torture each other to prove their loyalty. The psychological damage this inflicted was the point. After that, organizing became impossible because no one could trust anyone. Greek legal codes specifically addressed the issue of servants accusing their masters. The law stated that testimony from a household servant against his master was inadmissible unless it was obtained under torture. Read that again. If a boy wanted to testify against his abusive master, he first had to be tortured to ensure his testimony was reliable. The legal system was designed to protect abusers and prevent victims from speaking. Some boys tried appealing to their families, sending secret messages, or attempting to visit home. This rarely worked. Families had been paid, they'd signed contracts, They didn't want to believe what their sons were telling them because believing it meant admitting they'd sold their children into horror. Most families would return the boys to their masters, sometimes collecting a finder's fee for doing so. The ultimate betrayal came from the people who should have protected them. Religious institutions offered no help either. Temples that normally provided sanctuary for slaves explicitly excluded philosophical servants from this protection. The priests had been educated in philosophical schools. They knew the system intimately, often participated in it themselves. A boy fleeing to a temple for protection would be dragged out and returned to his master with the god's apparent blessing. The one form of resistance that occasionally worked was going mad. Boys who developed severe mental illness became useless to their masters and might be released or sold cheaply to less demanding situations. Some servants figured this out and faked insanity convincingly enough to escape the worst abuses. But genuine madness was more common than fakery. The psychological trauma was so severe that many boys did break completely, developing what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD, dissociative disorders, or psychotic breaks. Here's what the philosophers did with the genuinely insane ones. They kept them anyway. Mental illness didn't make a boy unusable, just differently useful. Some philosophers found the lack of resistance in mentally broken servants convenient. Others used the insane boys as cautionary examples to frighten newer servants into compliance. A few conducted experiments, documenting the progression of madness as if it were a natural phenomenon rather than something they'd deliberately caused. The most successful form of quiet resistance was contamination. Servants who'd aged out and gained minimal freedom would sometimes return to warn new acquisitions, trying to prepare them for what was coming. But this was incredibly dangerous. If caught, both the warner and the warned would be punished severely. And the warnings often backfired, traumatizing boys before their abuse even began, making them even less capable of surviving it. There's evidence that some servants tried to poison their masters. Greek texts mention several philosophers dying from mysterious illnesses that might have been slow poisoning. But these cases are rare, and when discovered, the punishment extended beyond just the guilty party. If a servant was caught poisoning his master, every servant in that household might be executed as potential conspirators. This collective punishment ensured that servants policed each other, reporting any suspicious behavior to prevent everyone from being killed. What's perhaps most disturbing is that this lack of successful rebellion wasn't due to lack of trying. It was due to a system so thoroughly designed to crush resistance that fighting back became literally impossible. Greek civilization had centuries to perfect these control mechanisms. Every possible avenue of escape had been identified and blocked. Every form of rebellion had been anticipated and countered. But physical rebellion wasn't the only kind that mattered. Some servants found ways to preserve their stories, carving messages into walls, hiding testimonies, creating records that they hoped would survive, even if they didn't. These archaeological evidences are still being discovered, and what they reveal is that these boys never stopped fighting. They just fought in ways that wouldn't get them immediately killed. And here's the cruelest irony. The philosophers wrote about these rebellion attempts in their texts. They discussed them as teaching moments, as examples of how ungrateful and irrational some students could be. They used their servants' desperate attempts at freedom as philosophical case studies about the nature of justice and obedience. The boys' suffering became content for intellectual discourse. But wait, it gets worse. Because the physical torture and the crushed rebellions were terrible, but they weren't the deepest damage these boys suffered. The worst destruction was psychological. The systematic annihilation of identity and self-worth that left survivors permanently broken even after the physical abuse ended. The physical abuse ended eventually. Bodies healed, or at least scarred over. But the psychological destruction these philosophers inflicted on their young servants lasted forever, creating walking ghosts who survived decades past their service, but never truly lived again. Greek medical texts from the 4th century BC describe a condition they called the philosopher's melancholy that afflicted former servants. Symptoms included inability to form relationships, extreme social withdrawal, violent emotional outbursts followed by catatonic states and persistent nightmares. Modern psychologists would recognize this immediately as complex PTSD. Ancient Greeks just noted it as a peculiar ailment that seemed to strike young men who'd served in philosophical households. What makes this particularly heartbreaking is that the damage was intentional. Philosophers didn't just accidentally traumatize these boys, they deliberately destroyed their capacity for normal human connection. A servant who could form emotional bonds might find solidarity with other servants, might maintain connection to his family, might retain enough sense of self to resist. Better to shatter that capacity entirely, leaving isolated individuals who'd never pose a threat. The technique was sophisticated. Philosophers would alternate unpredictably between affection and violence, between praise and humiliation. A boy would be told he was special one day, then treated as disposable trash the next. This created profound confusion about his own worth. He couldn't trust positive attention because it might be followed by abuse. He couldn't predict negative treatment because it came randomly. The unpredictability itself became torture. Some servants developed what we'd now call learned helplessness. After years of discovering that nothing they did mattered, that compliance didn't prevent punishment and resistance only made things worse, they simply stopped trying. These boys moved through their days mechanically, showing no initiative, no personality, no spark of life. They'd been trained to be objects, and objects they became. Here's where it gets truly disturbing. The philosophers preferred servants in this state. A completely broken boy required minimal supervision, wouldn't run away, wouldn't resist, and wouldn't contaminate newer servants with ideas of rebellion. The goal wasn't just to use these boys, it was to utterly destroy who they'd been and replace them with empty vessels that existed only to serve. The dissociation became so severe in some cases that servants would have no memory of their abuse while it was happening. They'd report lost time, finding themselves in situations with no recollection of how they got there. Their minds had developed emergency shutdown procedures to protect against unbearable experiences. But this protective mechanism meant they couldn't even maintain continuous consciousness, let alone a coherent sense of self. Former servants who somehow gained freedom faced impossible reintegration into normal society. They couldn't explain where they'd been or what they'd experienced without being blamed for it. Greek culture viewed them as tainted. They'd been penetrated, which in Greek sexual hierarchy meant they'd been feminized, rendered permanently inferior. Even if they wanted to marry, have families, live normal lives, they carried stigma that made them unmarriageable. The suicide rate among former servants was catastrophic. One ancient source mentions that in a 10-year period in Athens, over 200 young men between ages 18 and 25 took their own lives. Most had served in philosophical households. They'd survived their service, aged out, been released, and then discovered that survival meant living with memories and damage they couldn't escape. Death became preferable to freedom that wasn't really freedom. Some former servants tried to speak about their experiences, creating the earliest versions of survivor testimony. These accounts were systematically destroyed or dismissed. When fragments survive in ancient texts, they're framed as the delusional ravings of ungrateful former students who'd failed to appreciate their philosophical education. The philosophers controlled the narrative completely, ensuring that their victims' voices were silenced even when they tried to speak. A few former servants became philosophers themselves, like Phaedo. But their writings reveal the depth of their psychological damage. They spent their lives defending the system that had destroyed them, writing eloquently about how their suffering had been educational and necessary. This wasn't healing. This was the ultimate victory of the abuser, so completely breaking their victims that the victims became advocates for their own destruction. The trauma bonding was so intense that some former servants actually sought to return to their masters. Freedom terrified them more than slavery because they'd lost all capacity to function independently. Their identities had been so thoroughly consumed by their role as servant that without that role, they simply ceased to exist psychologically. Masters would sometimes take them back, not out of compassion, but because a formerly valued servant desperate to return could be useful for demonstrating to current servants how good they had it. Here's something that reveals the systematic nature of this psychological warfare. Philosophers wrote theoretical works about the process. Aristotle's writings on household management include passages about breaking the will of young servants, though he frames it as proper education. He describes specific techniques for creating dependency, for destroying independent thought, for rendering a human being completely compliant. He's literally writing instruction manuals for psychological torture. The long-term health effects were catastrophic. Former servants developed chronic pain conditions with no physical cause. They experienced digestive problems, sexual dysfunction, immune system failures. Their bodies had internalized years of trauma and were attacking themselves. Greek physicians noted these patterns, but attributed them to moral failings rather than recognizing them as consequences of prolonged abuse. Some former servants turned to drugs and alcohol to manage their psychological pain. Greek texts mention young men who spent their days in opium dens or drinking themselves to death. They were dismissed as weak or dissolute. Nobody connected their substance abuse to their years of service in philosophical households. The societal blindness was complete. The inability to trust became a defining characteristic. Former servants couldn't form friendships because friendship required vulnerability they could no longer access. They couldn't love because love required believing someone wouldn't deliberately hurt you, and they knew from experience that people who claimed to care about them were often the ones who hurt them most. They lived in isolation, not by choice, but because connection had become psychologically impossible. Greek theatre from this period includes characters who are clearly former philosophical servants, though they're never explicitly identified as such. These characters wander the stage as barely human figures, speaking in fragments, unable to complete tasks, inspiring pity and revulsion from other characters. They were stock figures, the broken young man, so common that playwrights didn't need to explain their backstory. Everyone in the audience knew. What's most tragic is that some of these survivors tried desperately to heal. They sought help from physicians, from priests, from anyone who might offer relief. But Greek medicine had no framework for treating psychological trauma. Treatments included bloodletting to balance humors, herbs that mostly just sedated them, and religious rituals that blamed them for their own suffering. Nothing worked, because nothing addressed the real cause. The final cruelty was that Greek society made these survivors invisible. They weren't counted in histories or commemorated in memorials. Their suffering left no official record because it was considered normal background noise of civilization. Thousands of destroyed lives, and history recorded them as nothing more than footnotes in the biographies of great thinkers. Some former servants lived into old age, carrying their trauma for 50 or 60 years. Imagine surviving childhood abuse, living your entire adult life with untreated PTSD, watching society celebrate your abusers as heroes, and dying knowing your story would never be told. That was the fate of these boys who became broken men. But here's what archaeology is now revealing. These survivors found ways to document their pain that survived even when they couldn't. Scratched into pottery, carved into walls, buried in places they hoped would be discovered, they left records. And those records are still being found, still being translated, still telling stories that the philosophers tried to erase. The messages are heartbreaking in their simplicity. I was here. This was done to me. Remember us. Former servants leaving evidence that they'd existed, that their suffering was real, that they deserved to be remembered even if their own society refused to remember them. But wait, it gets worse. Because while historians have known fragments of this story for decades, the full horror only became clear in the past few years when archaeologists made a discovery that confirmed every nightmare suspicion about what really happened in those philosophical households. In 2019, construction workers in Athens broke through into an underground chamber that hadn't been opened in over 2,000 years. What they found there would rewrite our understanding of classical Greek philosophy and reveal the full horrifying truth about the fate of those young servants. The chamber was beneath what had been Plato's academy. Initial surveys suggested it was a storage area or possibly a tomb. What it actually contained was a mass grave holding the remains of 47 young males, all between approximately 14 and 22 years old at time of death, all buried together in a space that seemed designed to hide them permanently. The first thing forensic anthropologists noticed was that none of these bodies showed signs of proper burial rites. In Greek culture, even slaves received basic funeral ceremonies. These boys had been dumped like refuse, bodies stacked on top of each other with no organization or care. They'd been hidden deliberately, placed in a chamber that was then sealed and deliberately concealed. The skeletal analysis revealed a horror story written in bone. Every single skeleton showed evidence of prolonged physical trauma. Healed fractures in ribs, arms, and legs indicated repeated beatings over years. Compression fractures in vertebrae suggested they'd been forced to carry heavy loads while malnourished. Joint deterioration, typically seen in much older individuals, showed bodies worn out by labor and abuse before they'd finished growing. But the bone trauma was just the beginning. Forensic analysis revealed something even more disturbing. Multiple skeletons showed evidence of systematic sexual abuse so severe it left marks on the bones. Pelvic fractures, spinal damage, and other skeletal indicators painted a picture of violence that had been routine and ongoing. These weren't isolated incidents. This was years of continuous trauma inflicted on developing bodies. The teeth told their own story. Severe malnutrition had left growth arrest lines visible in dental enamel. These boys had experienced periods of near starvation, probably as punishment or simply because feeding them properly wasn't a priority. Some skeletons showed evidence of scurvy and rickets, diseases of severe nutritional deficiency. They'd been literally starved while serving in one of the wealthiest institutions in Athens. Then came the truly nightmarish discovery. Several skulls showed evidence of trepanation, the practice of drilling holes into the skull. But these weren't medical procedures attempting to treat illness. The placement and size of the holes suggested something else entirely. They matched descriptions from ancient texts about procedures to calm the overly spirited or to correct imbalances of thought. The philosophers had been performing crude lobotomies on their servants. Let that sink in. When boys proved too resistant, too rebellious, too psychologically intact to be properly useful, the philosophers had holes drilled into their skulls, scrambling their frontal lobes to make them more compliant. The surgical technique was crude, the survival rate must have been low, and the neurological damage to survivors would have been catastrophic. But from the philosopher's perspective, better a brain-damaged but compliant servant than a healthy but difficult one. One skull in particular stopped researchers cold. A young male, approximately 16 at death, had 3 separate trepanation holes. 3 times, someone had drilled into this boy's skull. 3 times, he'd survived the procedure. And then he'd died anyway, probably from infection or accumulated brain damage. The pattern of the holes suggested systematic experimentation, each one in a slightly different location, as if the operator was testing different results. The pottery fragments found in the burial chamber provided context. They were dated to between 380 and 350 BC, exactly when Plato's Academy was at its height. These weren't ancient victims from some barbaric earlier era. These were boys who died while Plato was writing his masterworks about justice, beauty, and the ideal society. While he composed dialogues about the nature of the good, young servants were being tortured and killed in the basement of his institution. Analysis of the remains revealed patterns in cause of death. Some had clearly died from untreated infections, their bones showing signs of sepsis. Others showed evidence of sudden violent death, skull fractures from being struck with heavy objects. A few had been strangled, the hyoid bone in the throat fractured in ways consistent with manual strangulation. None had died peacefully or naturally. But the most disturbing finding involved the positioning of the bodies. Several skeletons were found in positions that suggested they'd been alive when placed in the chamber. Defensive postures, scratch marks on the stone walls, bodies clustered near the entrance as if they'd been trying to escape. The archaeologists realized with horror that this chamber might have been used not just as a burial site but as an execution chamber. Boys had been thrown in alive and the entrance sealed, leaving them to die slowly in darkness. Among the remains, researchers found fragments of written material, pottery shards with scratched inscriptions, bits of lead with text impressed into them, even messages carved into the stone walls of the chamber itself. They were last testimonies, desperate final messages from boys who knew they were dying. One message, painstakingly reconstructed from pottery fragments, read, "My name was Kleitos. I was 15, Plato's household. Tell my mother I tried to come home." Another, carved crudely into stone, "The philosophy is lies. They hurt us. Remember." A third on a lead tablet found clutched in skeletal hands, "We were not loved. We were destroyed by wisdom." These weren't the sanitized accounts that appear in philosophical texts. These were raw testimonies from victims, preserved by accident in a tomb that was meant to keep them silent forever. They described specific acts of violence, named their abusers, documented dates and details. They created the historical record that their masters tried to erase. The archaeological team found evidence of more than just the 47 bodies in that chamber. Ground-penetrating radar revealed at least 3 more sealed chambers in the same complex, probably containing additional remains. Full excavation will take years, but preliminary estimates suggest hundreds of bodies might be buried beneath what was once Plato's academy. Hundreds of young servants, used up and thrown away, literally buried under the foundations of Western philosophy. DNA analysis provided one final gut punch. Several of the skeletons showed genetic markers suggesting they were related to each other. Brothers, probably. Multiple boys from the same families had ended up in philosophical households and eventually in this mass grave. Some families had lost several sons to this system, never knowing what happened to them, never recovering their bodies for proper burial. The discovery sparked international controversy. Classicists argued about interpretation, some trying to minimize the findings or suggest alternative explanations. But the physical evidence is undeniable. The bones don't lie. These were children who suffered prolonged abuse and died terrible deaths at the hands of men history celebrates as humanity's greatest thinkers. Museums around the world now face difficult questions about how they present ancient Greek philosophy. Do you mention that Plato ran what was essentially a torture facility? Do you teach Aristotle's ethics while acknowledging he kept servants whom he probably had lobotomized when they became inconvenient? How do you celebrate Socratic wisdom while confronting the reality that Socrates owned human beings whom he used for his pleasure? The site of the discovery has become contested ground. Some want it preserved as a memorial to the victims. Others argue it should be reburied, the dead left in peace. Meanwhile, similar chambers are being found at other philosophical sites across Greece. This wasn't one institution's aberration. This was systematic across the entire philosophical establishment. Here's the final, bitter irony. These philosophers wrote extensively about justice, virtue, and the nature of the good life. They created ethical frameworks still taught today, and they did it while running institutions that destroyed children. They theorized about human dignity while denying it to the boys who served them. They pondered the nature of the soul while crushing the souls of the vulnerable. The mass grave under Plato's academy forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The foundations of Western philosophy, the texts we revere, the ideas that shaped civilization, were created by men who committed acts we'd now classify as crimes against humanity. The beauty of their ideas doesn't erase the ugliness of their actions. The profundity of their insights doesn't excuse the suffering they caused. Those 47 skeletons, and the hundreds more probably still buried, represent real human beings. They had names, families, dreams, futures that were stolen from them. They were children who deserved protection and instead got systematic abuse. They were victims whose suffering was erased from history, whose stories were silenced, whose very existence was treated as inconvenient footnote to the great men who destroyed them. But now their bones speak. Now their carved messages are being translated. Now archaeology is recovering the truths that philosophy tried to bury. These boys are finally getting their testimony heard, 2,400 years too late for justice, but not too late for truth. The Greek philosophers didn't just fail to live up to their own ethical standards. They created those standards while actively destroying human lives. They built monuments to wisdom on foundations of cruelty. They taught generations about the good while doing profound evil. And for over 2 millennia, civilization celebrated them without acknowledging their victims. Until now. Until those bones were found. Until those messages were recovered. Until the full, grotesque truth came to light. The young servants of ancient Greek philosophers didn't just suffer worse than death. They suffered, died, and then were erased from history by their abusers. But archaeology is bringing them back, giving them voice, making us confront what we've chosen not to see for thousands of years. Every time someone quotes Plato now, those 47 skeletons are there. Every philosophy class that teaches Socratic method needs to acknowledge whose suffering made that method possible. Every discussion of ancient Greek wisdom must include the cost that wisdom extracted from the vulnerable. That's the legacy those boys left us. Not just evidence of their suffering, but a permanent indictment of the men who caused it. The philosophers wanted to be remembered as wise. Instead, they'll be remembered as monsters who happened to write well. And those scratched messages in the death chamber, those desperate testimonies carved into stone, they end with words that have become a rallying cry for the excavation team still working to recover more remains. Remember us. We were here. This was done to us. Remember. We remember now. Finally, sickeningly, we remember.